Good afternoon, and thanks for joining the Progressive Policy Institute's webinar, What Worked? Remote Instruction in a Time of COVID-19. For those of you new to PPI, we are a nonprofit catalyst for policy innovation and political reform based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to create radically pragmatic ideas for moving America beyond ideological and partisan deadlock. I'm Tressa Pankovitz. I'm the Associate Director of the Reinventing America's Schools project at PPI, titled after the book authored by our director, David Osborne. We believe America needs a 21st century model of public education geared to the knowledge economy, and that charter schools and innovation schools are showing the way because they give schools autonomy, they create accountability, and they provide choice for parents. The purpose of today's webinar is twofold. In addition to worrying about keeping our families safe and healthy once the coronavirus was upon us, everyone with children or a connection to children or a connection to our schools watched with great concern as education systems watched as they struggled to switch to delivering instruction from a distance. We learned almost instantly that access to connectivity and access to devices is a serious equity issue. As time went on, we saw large public school systems struggle to keep students engaged and sometimes even to keep track of their students. We heard stories of frustrated teachers who were challenged with new, unfamiliar burdens on their time and talents as they endeavored to stay connected to their students, oftentimes while trying to take care of their own children. As one who quarantined with a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, I have firsthand knowledge of how stressful it was for all parties involved. And I saw the detrimental effect on the kids from being isolated from their classmates and their teachers. But anecdotal evidence aside, we thought it was important now that summer is here and maybe we have a chance to take a breath for a minute, to look back and get a window on how various types of schools responded to the new challenges thrust upon them. So we are thrilled to have with us today the Center for Reinventing Public Education's practitioner in residence, Bree DeSalt, along with Public Impact's Vice President for Data Analytics, Lyria Boast. They are going to start us off with a data-driven look at what really happened to our schools this spring. After that, we are going to hear from 3 school leaders of charter school networks who helped steer their schools in a fast pivot to distance instruction and learning. I'll ask them to more thoroughly introduce themselves when we hit that part of the program, but they are, and we welcome Joanna Smith, Washington, D.C. Regional Director for Rocket Ship Public Schools, Amy D'Angelo, Regional Superintendent, Achievement First Charter Schools, and Brian Riddick, Principal at Butler Prep of the Noble Network of Charter Schools in Chicago. After the data part of the program, we'll pause for questions before going into our chat with Joanna, Amy, and Brian. So please, as we go, use the chat function to submit questions that you have for Bree and Lyria. And with that, I will turn it over to SERPI and Public Impact.
Great, thanks so much, Tressa. It's nice to see everyone. Lyria is pulling up our deck right now, and we will dive in just to set a frame from learning from our great colleagues at various charter management organizations. Lyria, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I'm introduce myself. I'm Lyria Boast. I'm with Public Impact. Public Impact is a research and consulting firm in North Carolina. We were founded in 1996, and our mission is to improve education dramatically, especially for students of color, economically disadvantaged students, and other students who have not historically been well met. Needs have not been well met. We pursue this mission by conducting research and data projects like the one we'll be presenting today in service of excellent charters, and also by partnering with school systems across the country to implement opportunity culture models that enable excellent teachers to extend their reach to more students. Bree, do you want to?
Sure. So I'm Bree DeSalt. Yeah, I work with the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and the center's mission is very similar to what we've heard from Public Impact and the Progressive Policy Institute. We work to try to provide transformative evidence-based ideas to improve education and to ensure all students are prepared for a rapidly changing future. My previous experience, and what probably gives me my title as a practitioner in residence, most recently, is that I recently ran a charter management organization here in Washington State. I ran the Green Dot network of schools, and I've also been an area superintendent with Seattle Public Schools, as well as a principal and a teacher. So it's great to be here with you all today.
Sorry, I'm getting the slide moving correctly. So Bree and I are going to take a few minutes to share some data with you. First, we'll share the research approach that SERPI really developed, and then we have followed on with. We'll share out some findings from that research and implications for the fall reentry. So really, as Tressa said, when schools started to close across the country in March, districts and charter, all schools really were struggling to develop distance learning plans. SERPI really very quickly began documenting how districts and charter schools were responding, and quite impressively, quickly again put out documentation on the plans that districts and schools had for curriculum, for dealing with technology, for dealing with engagement with students. And Bree will give a little bit more detail about that in a minute. That initial and very quick documentation of the response was really valuable, and I'm sure many of you have been following that through the spring. But the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools reached out to Public Impact, and we partnered with them, again, building on the SERPI research, to use that same methodology and that same research approach to see how a broader representative sample of charter operators nationwide have responded to COVID. Sorry, so Bree will explain, to give a little, more detail about the approach that SERPI used, and then I'll explain a little bit what we've done using the same approach for charter operators, and then we'll move into sharing some of the initial results.
Great. So we actually have two projects or databases that we're going to be talking through findings from here. One is what's referenced here, which is a national representative sample of districts. And so this database is a very big database. It captures 477 districts and creates statistically representative and a statistically representative sample of districts that has predictive power to represent the landscape of the national district approach to COVID closure responses. And we had a second database which drove a lot of our initial findings that Lyria was referencing, where we were tracking really every week what was happening starting that third week of March when schools started closing. And that database was built off of 82 districts and 18 charter management organizations. The results were pretty similar, and we can talk a little bit about how these two sets generated some differences, but really the trends and patterns were pretty similar across both databases. And so for both of these projects, we had a pretty big research team who reviewed publicly available information. And that, I think, is going to be the big caveat that I will give to anything that we share, which is that what we did not do, because we were trying to rapidly get information out, is we didn't do deep dive studies into all of these, either 100 or 477 districts. But what we did do is reviewed websites, social media channels, and general media reporting on each of the districts, again, on a weekly basis for the 82, or at one moment in time for the 477. And some other things where we did get more information anecdotally was we are also, for other projects, working on some deep dives of charter management organizations and districts, as well as a project working to interview parents. And we are compiling all of the survey data that is out there. So that information did inform our information, but the numbers you see will be based on publicly available information.
Great. So similarly, Public Impact, we selected a sample of 356 charter school operators nationwide. That sample is nationally representative, and it includes 325 freestanding charter schools and then 31 network operators. That includes both CMOs and EMOs. The process that we then followed to collect data and review documentation followed the SERPI protocols. We reviewed websites and we reviewed social media outlets. And as you can imagine, there was quite a range of both level of detail as well as comprehensiveness of plans. So that, those were ranges that we saw across all types of operators. We coded across 13 of the 15 SERPI indicators, and those indicators, again, we'll go into them a bit, ranged from many of them that we were looking at really allowed us to see how much charter operators were engaging directly in instruction with students, and also how, to what degree charter operators were working to provide internet connection. So what I will say is that unfortunately our report is not out yet. It'll be out later this summer. Many of the trends that you'll see in the slides we saw in that representative national sample of charter operators, we definitely saw high levels of engagement with students. What we did as an additional piece was we did do a deeper dive with 5 operators. With those 5 operators, we did interviews with a range of the school community, with school leaders, teachers, and families. So while our report is not out yet, we hope that you all will look for that soon. We wanted to share some of those great lessons learned in the deeper dive with a selection of the charter operators. We really heard, and this was carried out in the data that we collected, that charter operators were able to use their charter autonomy to respond very quickly. So we often saw quicker response rates from charter operators than districts, larger districts. They were able to work immediately to get logistics and basic needs in place. I mean, many districts as well were focused on the same items, but we heard first was the food services, getting packets out, establishing how they would communicate with family, and seeing what resources there were to provide technology. One place that operators really could, that charter schools could really leverage their resources was on their strong relationships with students and families. So we saw that often they already had these strong relationships in place, and they were able to immediately connect with families and students and get engagement processes and systems in place. We saw a priority on setting up synchronous instruction where possible. Obviously, there is a wide range of connectivity resources available in different parts of the country and for different communities. But we saw operators really focused on, again, direct instruction wherever possible, and higher levels of synchronous learning than we tended to see in the district counterparts. And the focus on rigorous and thoughtful instruction that clearly communicated in our interviews with the operators, and a real commitment to working to reduce learning loss going into fall. So Bree, I'll turn it to you.
Great, thanks so much, Lyria. And as I dive into some of the results of what we've seen from the spring, I think I'll just start with a huge thank you to everyone, both just making time over your summer and an acknowledgement of what your worlds and lives have probably been like for the last 4 or 5 months. And I'm really, really excited to set some framework and then to really learn from Brian, Amy, and Joanna, who are living this every day on the ground, and the complexity of this kind of unprecedented time. So I mentioned this in our introduction, but what I'm going to review with the group now is our what we call our deep dive database. And this is information where we kind of tracked over on a week-by-week basis from March through schools stopped updating information, districts stopped updating information in May, really from March through May, what was happening on a week-by-week basis across the country in these 100 different charter and district operators. And I have a couple preliminary results from a new set of studies that we're doing both on summer school and what summer schools looked like. And we're just starting to dive into fall planning and looking at fall district reopening plans right now. So we're all in the thick of it. And my guess is that a lot of us on this call and probably even on this panel are also creating and figuring out these plans live as we talk. So interesting times. So I think moving to the next slide, let's give just a quick overview of where these kind of like what we looked at. So in terms of our districts, they spanned most of the geography of the country. You'll see that they erred on the side of large. So most of our districts that we looked at were larger urban systems. We did have some smaller rural and suburban districts, but the average district size of 110,000 is pretty big for a district. And you can see that the CMOs that we looked at, while we did choose the largest CMOs in the Charter School Growth Fund's portfolio, we did, the districts are much, much bigger than the CMOs that we are studying. And so there just is a difference there and an important caveat to make. Moving on to the next slide. Thank you. These are all of the CMOs that we looked at. And I think all three of our panelists are going to be able to deep dive from represent the 3 of the 18 here. And high level, what we found in the spring, and this is again, including districts, and really most of our data came from districts, was that generally few students consistently experience synchronous instruction. There might be a blend of asynchronous or synchronous, or in many cases, especially on the district front, there weren't clear expectations set for live, or in many cases, even pre-recorded instruction. Where there was guidance given on instructional minutes, it was significantly lower, and pretty low for elementary grades, especially. We'll look at one slide on this, but was typically districts would set as low as 30 minutes a day for, say, kindergarten level, up to maybe 2 to 3 hours a day as guidance for families. And it did range, but it seemed to be somewhere between that 30 minutes to 3 to 4 hours a day based on the age of the student in the district when there was recommendation given. This idea of access that I know we're all trying to figure out really varied. We did see districts try really hard to get devices out to students, and the vast majority of districts did do that. And then actually districts tried, a range of districts tried strategies to get hotspots out to families as well. We didn't see quite as much information coming out of the CMOs on that, but it was more not having information on what exactly the strategies were, because again, we only looked at publicly available information. Something that I found very interesting was there was just a very low number of required attendance tracking. So there are a lot of districts who just don't have that data from the spring of which students accessed instruction and which did not. And a lot of districts opted to do different types of grading systems, but steered away from standards-based grading. Again, some districts were the exception to the rule and some CMOs were exceptions to the rule here, but that was a general finding. Generally, supports for students with special needs and especially English language learners, there was very little detail on what that looked like. And I think the high level thing that we found and definitely matches with the interviews that we did with parents was just, and it's a reality of when the school goes from the physical building to the home, is that parents and guardians and caregivers played a very, very important role in their students' or children's education. And so that was a factor that seemed to drive a lot of the experience that students did or did not have over the spring. Moving into the next slide, this gives you a sense of how things changed over time. When we first, by April 3rd, we actually started tracking in early March or mid-March, excuse me, but by April 3rd, we did have a count of how many of those districts were providing what we would consider elements of a remote learning plan, which include assessment, instruction, and curriculum provision. And you can see in the green columns that the vast majority of districts at the very beginning were mostly providing like links to general resources that families or caregivers could peruse on their own, or some kind of formal curriculum that was curated and directive, but did not really provide instruction or progress monitoring. By the end of the school year, roughly like when kind of changes to remote learning stopped taking place in May, about 2/3 of districts were providing a more comprehensive plan, which included some type of progress monitoring, provision of curriculum, and some kind of instructional expectations. If we move on to the next slide, you can compare that to the CMOs in our study, which, by April 3rd were similarly communicating about their resource provision and curriculum provision. More of them by April 3rd, almost half, actually had a full kind of, at least, I don't know if I should say full, but certainly had those 3 elements in place. And the vast majority of CMOs that we looked at, about 4/5 by May 22nd, did have all of those elements in place and communicated out. Some of the examples we'll go into are actually from some of the networks that we've got represented here. Going into the next slide. This is a comparison of how CMOs and districts monitored progress. This was one area where we found that CMOs pretty quickly dove into different types of progress monitoring while districts lagged. Districts did catch up more by the end, but it was a pretty big area of difference at the beginning. Almost all CMOs are providing feedback on work. About half are asking teachers to assign grades, which actually is not that different than districts. By the end, at the beginning, there was a difference, but at the end, it was about the same. And then more CMOs were also requiring check-ins with families and or students. And, one tool that I imagine we'll hear about is just the advisory or homeroom system that CMOs tend to have, which provided a really easy way for CMOs to, quickly kind of actualize the check-in process. And in general, while we weren't studying like why certain districts and CMOs could respond faster, it felt like, based on our journey of watching them week over week, was that just certain districts and certainly CMOs had structures in place that allowed them to, when schools closed, more quickly pivot. And especially if they had a more centralized education system. And I'd be curious to hear if this proves true from Amy, Brian, and Joanna, but if you had a more centralized education system to begin with, it was obviously a lot easier to get it out to students. Whereas if it was really distributed, then it was more school by school or classroom by classroom based. On the next slide, you can see that we've got some examples of one way that CMOs really seem to distinguish themselves from districts, and that I believe is going to be a critical part of this fall's strategies, which is just re-envisioning what people are doing and reimagining and redistributing resources. In general, we saw and could read about how CMOs were dividing and conquering tasks to build efficiencies, and increasing and encouraging collaboration. Amy, we actually found, we were able to find a document that you all have made public at Achievement First. And so, this may be outdated and you can build off of it, but we were really impressed with the ways that Achievement First outlined expectations for their staff, and with like I'd say like a gentleness and an acknowledgement that a lot of staff have children of their own, and it was just a very good example of how an organization communicated out clarity of expectation with give and take, and then based on that could really redesign and, as I understand it, really deploy a pretty full educational experience for its students. Then we're kind of getting to the end here. On the next slide, what I mentioned this, I'll just briefly touch on it. But one thing that we did notice was that elementary students just seemed to receive fewer instructional minute requirements, and generally got access to less types of like educational provisions. I would say certainly like live instruction, feedback, etc. We really were trying to find elementary examples of live instruction, especially at like kindergarten, first and second grade level. They may be out there, but we just weren't able to find a lot of examples of that. And I think that some networks and districts very intentionally chose not to do things like live instruction because of technology and developmental differences for students, and took different types of prioritization like strategies to support elementary students. If we go on to the next slide, this is just a quick little teaser of what we've been finding from the summer and fall. Just basically, we looked for what our district's doing to think of summer as this really take advantage of an opportune time to kind of pilot or practice things that they may want to put in place in the fall more uniformly. And we really spent most of our time looking at districts. You'll see that the vast majority of organizations provided summer school. I would say that based on what we could read and learn about, it felt like it was still pretty traditional. There weren't a lot of innovations happening or things being piloted, but there was a real focus on credit recovery and catching students up with what they might have missed over the spring. And then, the story on fall reopening is that it's changing a lot. I've already just this morning read 2 or 3 new plans, but districts especially are still just starting to put out even draft plans. And something that we found very interesting, this chart is from about a week and a half ago, but the vast majority, this is just districts, the vast majority, and CMOs, I think, were even less than this, but we just had a smaller sample size, so we only put out the 100 districts, are just not putting information out publicly yet about what's happening next year. Now, this is shifting, really starting last week. We started to see plans, and so actually, if you are interested in the fall and the forward looking, and you track our website, serpi.org, we'll be publishing each week starting next Monday, weekly findings from fall planning. And we will have about 10 plans analyzed by this week. And then we hope about at least 10 every week after that, building up as we get more information. But the story of the fall seems to be that there's still a lot that districts are figuring out, and CMOs. So implications that I mentioned, and I think that this, I hope, tees up our next speakers, because I've seen actually a lot of these networks that are on the line today working through this, but just what does access look like when you have potentially a whole year? An equitable education is just not possible if you don't even have technology, internet devices in place. And what does that mean? That's not always a problem that a district or CMO is expected to solve. So that's something we're very curious about. What does high quality instruction and learning look like? And how do students receive support from different adults if they have to be in a virtual learning environment? And, I think that this probably, a lot of this we got from great operators in the spring. So this may go in, without saying, but the more communication provided to families, I think the better. That is just something that we have heard. And if you've followed the McKinsey studies going out on this, seems to be a really big learning from the international community and countries reopening is just how important to families over communicating is during this time, and transparency, especially around students with special needs and English language learners, continues to be something that we're just not seeing a lot of information on. And then kind of these last 2 points I'm really excited to learn about, because we haven't seen a lot of this yet, but thinking about how districts and networks, charter networks, are leveraging really strapped resources to rely on the expertise of their community, different community organizations, other agencies, and redefining the roles so that people are really honed in on what's most important to that community and that district or operator, are things we're all really excited to learn more about. And I think that is pretty much, I think that is everything. I don't think we have any more. It's just like who we are. So I thank you for letting us go first, and I'm excited to mostly listen and learn now to Brian, Joanna, and Amy.
Well, Bree and Larry, that was great. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you because that obviously looks like you put a lot of work into that and a lot of thought into that. And I know everybody that's watching really appreciates it. And we do have a couple questions. So one question that came in was, are the proportion of districts' remote learning strategies weighted by student enrollment? And could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Jonathan. It is really just based on district. We did not do any weighting. The representative sample weighted for size of district. And so because the average district in the States is, actually relatively small, we had a lot more rural, suburban, smaller districts in the representative sample, which was that larger sample. But in terms of the way we reported out findings and the charts you saw here, is it was just done district by district. Maybe one caveat, and if this is kind of what your question is getting at, is to compare this data set, which is of, again, a non-representative sample of larger, more urban districts. Almost all of the data for the representative sample was actually lower. So, one difference we did see was that larger districts in this sample seemed to, we're not sure why, but maybe have more resources, be able to communicate better what they were doing. And so these are kind of the rosiest kind of picture, rosier than the representative sample. And Lyria, I think the charter data was better, but mimicked that.
Yes.
And then another question is, did you get any data on only why 50% of either were requiring teachers to assign grades?
Lyria, you're smiling. Do you want to?
Well, yeah, I'll just say that anecdotally, we found really range of philosophical approaches to this, right? So some operators who felt strongly that it was not fair to grade in this situation, and even sometimes within organizations, lack of agreement on how that policy should be. So I think that sort of reflects some philosophical differences for you.
Got it. And then another question is the low count of CMO summer programs in line with other years, or is it different due to remote learning?
That is a great question. There's some, I don't know of any studies that have tracked CMO summer school provision. I think that might be a good question for the operators on this webinar to just see if there was a difference in their lived experience this summer. But it did feel that, as you noted, that fewer CMOs were a little bit more explicit about, we are not offering summer school this year. And, one of the things that we wondered about on the team was, is that because they actually did provide a more comprehensive learning experience over the spring, that they felt that there was more wiggle room to focus on getting ready for the fall.
We'll be sure to circle back on those. And there's a couple more questions in the chat, but maybe you ladies could answer them through the chat so that we can get to a couple of other things we want to do. The next thing we want to do is put up a poll. We always like to know at PPI who our audience is and who's attending. So please let us know if you're a teacher or a school network administrator, a funder, a researcher, an advocate, a policymaker, press, or a parent. And then we'll share those with you a little bit later. And now I want to move to introducing or letting them introduce themselves. Our school leaders who so generously have given us their time, and they will also tell you a little bit about their school's mission, and then we'll hear from each one of them individually. So I'd like to start with Joyanna Smith. Joyanna is DC Regional Director for Rocket Ship. And Joyanna, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your school's mission?
Sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity to join the panel. Can you hear me?
No, louder, a little louder.
Okay, these are not working. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join this panel. I'm super excited to be part of this group. I'm Joyanna Smith. I'm the DC Regional Director with Rocket Ship Public Schools and support the schools in DC. A portfolio of my work largely focuses on growth. So we're opening up our third campus in August. And then just quickly, our mission is to catalyze transformative change in disenfranchised communities through a public school model that propels student achievement. We also focus on developing exceptional educators and partnering with parents who enable high quality public schools to thrive in their community.
Great, thank you so much. Amy, coming to you next.
Hi, great to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Amy D'Angelo. I'm a regional superintendent at Achievement First. I've been in our network for 15 years. I started as a dean and then a principal. I was a founding principal of our Bushwick Middle School, and I've been a regional superintendent for the last 8 years. And right now I lead our high schools across Brooklyn and Connecticut. And our mission is to deliver on the promise of equal education for all of America's children. And at Achievement First, we strive for our students to realize their potential and develop the skills they need to graduate from college, succeed in a competitive world, and serve as the next generation of leaders in our community.
Thanks, Amy. And last but never, ever, ever least, Brian Riddick from Chicago. Brian.
Hey, everybody. My name is Brian Riddick, and I'm the principal at Butler College Prep. Butler is a campus on the far south side. We're one of the campuses of the Noble Network of Charter Schools. The mission of Butler is to produce socially engaged and responsible citizens of the world through an academically rigorous education that's infused with the arts. It also emphasizes social justice and intercultural understanding of the human experience. Meaningful engagement in our academic programming by students, teachers, and staff is the crux of the Links experience. Thank you all for having me today.
Thank you, Brian. And I want to remind our audience that we're trying to set this up so that we'll have a little time at the end. So continue to shoot questions through the chat function. And if we, at the end, don't have time to get to all of them, hopefully we will, we'll make sure that we get you answers. So now, Joanna, I'm hoping that you can start us off and tell us a little bit about how Rocket Ship pivoted to distance learning this spring. And we'd love to hear, some of your strategies and some anecdotes and lessons learned. So why don't you share some of that with us?
Sure. Thanks again for this opportunity to talk about our work regarding distance learning. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is a very complicated time with COVID-19 and its overall impact, and we would not be successful without our teachers and our Rocket Ship DC team members who have been dedicated and relentless in the pursuit of excellence for all of our students. Just want to give sort of a quick snapshot of who we are. So last year we had 2 DC campuses, Rocket Ship Legacy Prep and Rocket Ship Rise Academy. And between both campuses, we had about 1,300 students for a grade span of pre-K 3 through 5. At our Rise campus, I just want to give you a little demographic information. 33.7% of our students were homeless. 75.5% were SED, so socioeconomically disadvantaged, and 12.4% were receiving special education services, and 98% were African American with about 1% Latinx. It's very close at our second campus, and then as I mentioned, we're opening up our third campus in August. I would like to provide a brief overview of our transition from in-person learning to distance learning. I was a couple of business days away from returning back from maternity leave when the deputy mayor's office called me at around 10 p.m. on March 12th to inform us that the traditional school system in DC, called DC Public Schools, was about to close due to COVID. So we started to scramble a bit, as we knew that there might be a closure, but everything seemed to be moving so quickly. We held a parent meeting the next day in order to inform them of the very real possibility of a closure. And then we went from there. When we would transition to distance learning, we operated with 4 guiding principles. The first, the health and safety of our students and of our staff. The second, the continuity of learning, really focusing on offering a full day of school for our students. Third, our relationships. We know that our relationships are so important with our students and families and our teachers. And then the last is that relationships matter. So our model matters, but at the crux of it is our relationships. And so we needed to really think about refining and when necessary, really rethink how to cultivate these critical relationships in this very new environment. We also thought about things in 3 different buckets. So innovation, equity, and access. So innovation, we already, as you know, offered blended learning. And so we already had what we believe to be an innovative approach to learning, really focused on personalized learning. And really focused on community. Part of our pillar, one of our pillars is parent power. So community has always been at the center and at our core since our first day. Distance learning really was an extension of our model. So built on community, innovating and iterating to continue to find better ways to serve our kids holistically. So we looked at engagement under that bucket. So that's really looking at, were students logging in every day? Were they making progress every day? Were teachers regularly checking in with our students? And then we looked at equity. That was mentioned a little earlier in the presentation. And so we really focused on ensuring that all students could participate in distance learning. And so we really looked at all of our students, but in particular, our most vulnerable students. So our students who receive special education services were a particular focus to make sure that our general education teachers worked hand in hand with our integrated special education teachers, paraeducators, mental health providers, and network team members who provide, support on special education services. And then finally, we really focus on access. So across our network, we deployed thousands and thousands of computers to our families. And so we really worked hard to make sure that every child had access to a computer. So if you needed a computer, we gave you one. And then going into next year, we are focused on making sure that all of our schools across the entire network are one-to-one. So I'll stop there, I'll pause there. I know, Tressa, you might have some questions. So I told you I would give a very brief overview. Hopefully it was brief enough.
No, it was perfect. And what a way to come back from maternity leave. Was that your first baby?
My second baby, so it made it a little easier.
Well, talk to us about the full school day. Why was Rocket Ship determined from the outset that kids were going to get a full day of school?
Right. So we know that given the population that we serve, that a lot of our children would potentially be behind. And so that's something we really focused on. And so thinking about blended learning already, which was, of course, at the core of our model, we've always focused on growth and making sure that we're focusing on growth for that particular student. And so from our perspective, it wasn't necessarily about offering live instruction all day, right? Although we did transition, I think that was mentioned earlier, into live instruction throughout each day. And that was actually after spring break, which I believe happened in April. So there was some time to sort of transition. But we also looked at community, as I mentioned earlier. So that is launch, which is the character building there are character building activities, there are celebrations that occur. It's a way to just get ready for your day. So our families and our students join that. There's, like I said, live instruction. There is instruction that is, of course, recorded that you can access. Our kids are also checking in with their teachers. They're also doing a landing at the end of the day to sort of talk about their day. We also share updates with our communities at that time. So it is really an experience we're hoping from 8 o'clock in the morning through 3 p.m. that students are engaged throughout the day. And I know as a parent of two, that engagement is really important.
Yeah, it sure is. Talk a little more about the landing at the end of the day. What does that mean?
Yeah, the landing is it serves different purposes. One is to really just check in with everyone, to see people online and kind of make sure that everyone is okay. It's also an opportunity to give updates as to things that have happened throughout the day that you want parents and students to be aware of. And it's always an opportunity to offer celebrations, right? So when kids have done something really well, we use that as an opportunity for them to be celebrated and to also support and celebrate their peers.
So when they come together for a landing, is sort of the whole class online together in a Zoom and with the teacher there? Is that how it works?
Yeah, usually the whole community is there. And so oftentimes it will be a campus that will participate in the landing. As throughout when we have in-person learning, when we have launch and landing, that's something that our entire school community, that being that particular campus, can participate in.
And did you have any data, even informally, on how students did? This was a question that came in to us earlier in the last quarter or the last semester of the school year as compared to just the previous one when none of this was happening?
Yeah, so I would say a lot of it is sort of anecdotal. So we, a few things to consider. We did not offer grades at the end. We didn't feel like it was equitable. We knew that people had, children had different circumstances at home, and we were all thrown into this at the last minute. There wasn't any planning and not the same ability to set expectations for families in the way that we have been doing over the summer going into next school year. And so when we look at sort of achievement, it, we looked at it in a few different ways. One, it's looking at really engagement. So making sure that our students were engaged with the online learning programs, that they were showing up for their teacher check-ins, that we were looking at how they were, we were measuring progress, and so how they were progressing through the online learning programs to have a sense, we had a sense of like how well the students were doing. We are, of course, having conversations about sort of how that will change going into next year, and have those conversations both internally, but also throughout the city. Because we know that this is very different, really looking to partner with others to engage in best practices. And we also know from our authorizer that the accountability systems are being tweaked a bit. And so for us, what really matters is making sure that each and every student is progressing and that they're learning.
I have so many questions. I could talk to you for hours, but really quick, tell everybody who's watching a little bit about the blended learning, because people who aren't kind of inside baseball like all of us, they might not really know what blended learning is.
Yeah, so blended learning has always, like I said, been part of our model. And so we use a number of online learning programs like ST Math, Freckle Math, Lexia Core, which is focused on phonics. And so these are things that actually, it's sort of why we had a head start with respect to transitioning over to COVID, because we already had those things in place. What I will also add is that we have always had learning labs, but we really started last year and probably a little bit before that, really thinking about how to really focus on innovation and learning outside of sort of the humanities and STEM in a way that felt like it was much more hands-on. So thinking about robotics and other things. So even though typically students had 90 minutes on online learning programs, we really started to phase out sort of that strict requirement and looking at other ways that kids could engage throughout the day.
Got it. And tell me about tell us about the collaboration that's going on in Washington, D.C. You kind of mentioned that in passing. Is that really energetic and people?
It is. I mean, it has to happen. And so what I will say is, and I hope this is not snarky, I used to work in the district government and people always have negative things to say about it, but really they have really taken the lead and kind of fostering that collaboration. So bringing all charter LEAs, bringing in our DC public school system to conversations. It started off as daily, and it really felt like at that time we really needed daily because things were constantly changing. We did not know enough about COVID or how to do the work that we're doing. And so it really gave us this opportunity to hear from whether it was the Department of Health or from our Deputy Mayor for Education and others to kind of think about how the city is thinking about distance learning. And then now in the summer, we're meeting twice a week. But, you know, I think what's been really important is that we've shifted that conversation to sort of like being in the trenches and like, what are we doing? We don't know what we're doing, to really thinking about how do we reopen and how do we reopen in a safe way? How do we focus on supporting our families and our students? And I think it's just been such a great opportunity, and I give a lot of credit to the district.
Well, I think you sell yourself a little short saying you used to work for the government. You were the ombudsman for the Washington, D.C. public schools.
I was.
And that is a big job. And I have to say that during this, with the stress, with the emphasis on communication and reaching out to families, Rocket Ship's very lucky to have you. That must have been right up your alley.
Yes, I mean, so naturally I care about how we communicate with our parents, right? And then of course, jokingly, I hide when the ombudsman calls us. But you know, I do think that one of the things that we really focus on is, like I said, engaging our families. And it's been so important. So we've had focus groups, we have done surveys, we are also engaging our teachers. So we're just constantly engaging both to share regular updates about what we intend to do for next year, but also to hear from them about what we need to consider changing for next year.
Well, thank you so much. This has just been delightful hearing your story. Let's take a quick look at the results of that poll so that we can see who is with us today. So it looks like we've got 59% are teachers or network administrators, 4% are funders. We've got 13% researchers, that's great, 12% advocates, 5% policymakers. That's very important. Welcome to our policymakers. We hope you get a lot out of this today. 5% press and 3% parents. So welcome to everyone who is here. And let's quickly do the second poll before we move on to Amy D'Angelo, who has a great program for us. If we could get that second poll up there. Okay, so we want to hear what you think was the biggest challenge last spring. Lack of student connectivity, lack of student engagement, lack of innovation at the school level, teachers overwhelmed, unsupported, increased equity issues, or teaching methodology unable to transition to distance learning. And unfortunately, Zoom does not give us a function where you can write in your own answer if you have a different feeling about that. But I hope you'll take a second to click and vote. Okay, Amy D'Angelo, you're up.
Okay, great. I'm going to share a quick PowerPoint. We'll just be talking for the next like 5 to 10 minutes. And what I'm about to share will reflect briefly on the spring's remote learning. This is definitely a team effort, and shout out to all of our teachers, leaders, parents, and most importantly, students who work so hard. And what we'll be focusing mostly on then is sharing how we're applying a growth mindset and applying learnings from this year to improve upon this year to do better for next year. So let me just share screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. So like many of you, we sprang into action as of March with remote learning, and I'm focusing mostly on our high school model. We went to build a virtual high school strategy that was grounded in a synchronous model with asynchronous accommodations, and it was an effective short-term solution. We worked and hustled to get 99% of our students with internet access and 95% with laptops. And we had on average across our high schools, we have across our Connecticut and New York high schools, 91% daily attendance, meaning online participation of some form per day. And, you know, it's hard to get a really clear outcome indicator. It's definitely a growth area as we apply for next year, but as one comparison point, 71% of our high school students improved or sustained their GPA during remote learning, our Q4 of this year. It's a little bit of not apples to apples, so our grading policy shift, but is an indicator of just the trajectory of learning. Here are a couple of quotes from our spring parent survey for high school. Over 70% of our surveyed high school parents were satisfied or very satisfied with their child's remote learning experience. So we're proud of that, and eager, you'll hear later in the presentation how we're drawing on voices to improve upon that for next year. So that's really what I'm focused on now. I'd love to share kind of how we thought about learning to improve as we're likely to be tapping into remote learning again in either a hybrid learning context or remote learning. So there's 3 main levers I wanted to talk about around how we grounded in organizational values and mindsets. We've been doing year-long work with the National Equity Project, and we really applied the Leading for Racial Equity mindsets to our growth and improvement of what we need to do next year. We really listened, I think, in new ways and powerful ways to our stakeholders. I'll talk about that, and how we organized and collaborated as a high school team to have much stronger distributed leadership. So the first around the mindsets, here are some examples of the mindsets we really put at the forefront of the work. I pulled out like the aspect that we learned from National Equity Projects around listening with soft ears, like not listening with an agenda, but truly listening from a place of being genuinely open to what we're going to hear and seeking to understand. That was really central to how we drew upon the learnings, as well as just like embracing this mindset of like we each have inherent blind spots and like we're designing with and not for. So that those were kind of high, you know, all these were tapped into, but those were ones that really played out heavily. And the second kind of pillar is we really listen to stakeholders in new ways. So this is an overview of how we solicited input over the last few months. What I think was the most important shift is not drawing only from surveys, right? We all know that survey response, it just doesn't tell a full story. It's one data point, but there are marginalized voices. It doesn't really allow for probing. So I think the most important innovation was having like a range of interviews that were much more personal and enabled dialogue. And I'll share in a little bit about how we were intentional of how we targeted the interviews, as well as having just options for families, staff members, and students about like options for town halls, options like surveys. Surveys weren't the only lever, but they were one. And then there are ways of how families could and students could participate. For student interviews, we really wanted to get clear and like on different performance trajectories. So we made like these six categories of student performance, like who did actually better in remote learning. We had a subset of students that really thrived and improved. There are some students who had been doing really well and then had a drop off, and some that sustained. So we had like six categories of students, and we looked at both survey data, we looked at interview data in particular in these categories to look for trends across schools, as we tried to figure out what will work better for all profiles of students and to increase the trajectory across the board. Like as we thought about our program for next year, we keep referencing like a high ceiling and a high access and high ceiling. Like we want to ensure we're better serving more students and having like increased opportunity and challenge for those that are ready for that as well. So here are some examples of questions. Like we did a lot of open-ended, seeking to understand the experience of students in all the profiles, and similar questions for parents. So like, tell us about your experience. Tell me about your experience in remote learning. There's no right or wrong answer. We just want to understand so we can do better. Started very open-ended, and then got to a place where as we had prototypes of schedules that we might use for remote learning, then like built into like, what do you think about this? Like, here's an example of what a day might look like how is this better or worse? Or what do you like about this? And we found that starting and like funneling questions and starting broad and going narrow and then being able to probe from to the prototype level was very helpful for us to get into like an iterative cycle of now let's go back to the drawing board and approve upon it, and let's bring it back to stakeholders again. And that was very much from the work we had done with the National Equity Project, and was a shift in how we had operated before and at the scale of trying to like build a school schedule. And the parent interviews, we were very intentional about, and after the surveys came in, we looked to see like which voices are we not hearing enough of. And we were very proactive in working with schools to do follow-up interviews, having people with the strongest relationships doing the outreach. So there was the most like authentic information surfacing, and ensuring that we are proactively like reaching out to frontline workers, single parents, parents with multiple children, like trying to mine for our blind spots and like mine for whose voice could be more marginalized than others. And then applied the earlier mindset of like those with the greatest decision-making power, like being closest to the impact point, right? So I was making a lot of our ultimately the approver of some of our high school decisions, and I did direct interviews myself. I called students and talked to parents directly, not as the sole source of information, but there's just a texture of experience that we like have to hear directly and have to understand the impact of decisions in order to make the best calls. So, and then we created structures for collaboration and really looked as we planned for next year, like we formed a build team and a steering committee in high school. So our build team was like a small, nimble group. It was some school-based, 50% school-based, 50% network support. We tried to really have a group that would be the key like leaders of the performers and like building the prototypes based on what we were trying to achieve and what we were hearing. And a steering committee that was a broader cross-functional team that had representatives from each of our schools and had different experts on the team around operations and our team college and team student experience and special services, and ensured that they were kind of developing the vision of how we would build from stakeholder voice. And because advisory that was referenced earlier was such a key component, the student experience, like really deep dive on like getting our collective vision improved for advisory, that we could build from what worked best this last round and what didn't, and really apply a stronger vision there. So that got us to then when we started the build process, we started from like guiding principles. We started aspirationally and from guiding principles that we formed before we got into like the technical prototype building. This is an example of some of what we were trying to do, like starting, for example, with we want to like dramatically increase the culture of learning, like not just the engagement, but like just really having a vibrant culture of learning that students want to participate in. And everything coming from like how our stakeholders will be impacted, like what's the so what of teacher roles and on hours. We always referenced earlier around, you know, what does this mean for parents and those caring for loved ones, like just pressure testing everyone to an impact point of like the so what's of what this means for each of our roles. And, you know, examples of what we heard, we kind of categorized different aspects of what things were like what were we keeping from the spring strategy, what were we fixing? And then we would kind of, after doing interviews, come back and iterate to get a full picture of what we were prioritizing. And then this brought us to like kind of so here's some of the examples of the so what's, just to close out. Like we, you know, revised our daily advisory system. We ended up with a structural school day that was very different from what we call like a hybrid, go to a hybrid model and have roughly 50% synchronous, 50% asynchronous. And you know, that was really helpful to hear. Like I wasn't sure if students would prefer a day that was more spread out with longer breaks in between, or they'd rather have their synchronous learning with shorter breaks, but more back to back in the morning and have more asynchronous in the afternoon. That ended up being what we went with because we heard that as more favorable, and revised much of our curriculum assessment strategy, and prioritize content, realizing that trying to cover everything in the current climate is like not good for anyone, and like less is more. Let's be prioritized and figure out what's most important to cover effectively and to do in a meaningful way, and trying to do everything. Increase the digital learning and technology options to support instruction, which we now have aligned summer trainings to and kind of are in the mix of, as I'm sure everyone else is, as we now figure out, you know, operationalize all the initial decisions. But that's some of what we did on the how of change management, to take what worked and what didn't work in the spring and like apply a continuous improvement lens to how do we like now draw on more stakeholder voice and do a stronger job that will serve all students even more effectively for this next school year.
I muted myself. That was great, Amy. What an incredible amount of work. One of the questions that came in was, what platforms did you use?
In high school, we were obviously using Zoom, we were using Google Classroom. It varied by content area. Like for this last year, honestly, like Desmos and Nearpod were more variable. Like we kind of use different different aspects. This coming year, we have like a defined subset of shared platforms. Many of it overlaps across our secondary schools for middle and high school. I'm happy to send out a list of what we're doing if anyone's curious.
Yeah, I think people would like to hear that. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now let's take a look at the results of our second poll. It looks like connectivity, 10%, lack of student engagement, looks like a big issue with a lot of people, and increased equity issues at 34%. Teachers overwhelmed, 9%. Pretty good spread there. And then we're going to do one more poll before we go to our last panelist. What do you think is the most important focus for fall? Schools open and safe for maximum in-person learning, schools fully prepared to enact maximum distant learning, and schools fully prepared with a coherent hybrid model. And I guess if we all had a crystal ball, it would be much easier to answer those questions. But I'm very curious to see what people think the most important emphasis on that has to be. Okay, this brings us to Brian Riddick, a principal of Butler. High School in Chicago as part of the Noble Network. And I'm very excited to hear Brian talk because he is intensely engaged with students every day. But before I let him talk, I thought I would give you guys a treat and let you see him doing his job in action. This is him introducing the school's new remote learning center.
Hey Lynx, what's up? I hope all is well with you all. I'm excited today because we've actually revisioned a website that we already had in existence, butlerlinks.com, in order to make learning and accessibility to classroom materials a little bit more user-friendly for you all at home. And so I'm gonna walk you through it, share my screen, introduce you to it, and hopefully this will be a one-stop shop for you as we continue to think about how we make remote learning more accessible, how we make it easier, and how we increase engagement amongst our students. Hang on, let me share my screen and we will get started. Okay. When you go to butlerlinks.com, you will then come to this remote learning homepage. At the very top, we'll drop the most current update along with some quick announcements. We'll be editing that every single week so that you have the updates as quickly and as accessible as possible. We'll have a link directly to the newsletter so you can access that as well. We are really thinking about how to engage our students and how to increase participation. And so you'll see a merit scoreboard by class. We want to make sure that we celebrate the students who are engaged in learning. And so that'll be captured right here with this scoreboard. Then you have these grade level pages, which are also accessible by the top. So everything that you see down here, there's a quick go-to or a quick find in this space. I'm gonna pretend I'm a freshman. I miss my freshmen. I miss all the kids, but I especially miss freshmen. Go to grade level 9, and when you come here, we'll update this with like a student corner. We'll have some everyday updates by your teachers. We'll probably change that or toggle that every 2 days or even in some cases weekly. And then students can find their office hours here by clicking on a classroom, and it'll take them to a link so they can access Zoom in order to engage with teachers directly during their office hours. There's a tab here for announcements. And then there's also a form here for support. And so if you have a question and you don't know who to reach out to directly, you can just fill this form out, we'll get it, and then we'll know how to help you troubleshoot in order to solve the concern that you have. Finally, if you are trying to reach someone, you can actually just click on this directory. You can find email addresses here, and you can reach out to someone on campus. We're gonna update this so that everybody has a beautiful photo, so that in case you can't remember a name, you can remember the person by face. We're making every attempt to make this as simple as possible, but also as comprehensive as possible, because we don't want to sacrifice learning in the middle of this pandemic. So we're steady thinking about how we can make this better and better for our students. We understand that some changes are going to come down the pipeline, and we understand that some things have already changed, and sometimes change can be very frustrating. I ask for your grace and for your flexibility, because all the changes that we're making, whenever we make them, we're doing it with our students in mind and trying to make sure that it is in the best interest of advancing their education. Thanks, Lynx. Until next time, take care.
So there you have it, a high school principal encouraging his students to engage, showing them, walking them through it. Brian, I'd like to hear more about your strategies as you guys pivoted to distance learning.
Yeah, hey, thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your school too.
Yeah, sure. So Butler is on Chicago South Side on 103rd and Cottage Grove, more or less. We are going into year 8. I'm a founding staff member, and I could talk about Butler forever, so I won't derail there because I'll get stuck. We took a website that already existed for students, butlerlinks.com, and it was just a hub for all the things going on in the school, announcements. It was very student-facing in the way that we wanted them to have any kind of information we needed to pass along. But what we realized really quickly is that things were changing every single day with COVID. And as they were changing, we needed to figure out how to get information to students, but we also needed things to exist on one platform. And so when I say we revision and repurpose that website, it was effectively to make all of our jobs easier because we had questions coming from so many directions and we had these things that we needed to push out. We also had a lot of parents who were just reaching out and just saying, hey, I want to support my student in this way or in this way. What can I do? I want to contact a teacher. How can I do that? I want to access my students' Zoom with them. I want to make sure they're learning. And so the purpose of changing up the website in that way was explicitly so that we could make this process as simple as possible for not only students, but for their families as well. One of the beauties of Noble is the spirit of collaboration. And so the leadership teams from all 18 campuses really came together to think about how we could best navigate a virtual space. Just like everyone else, we were really thrown into having to adjust to virtual and remote learning. And so we gave ourselves a lot of grace in the beginning to just do our best and to figure things out. But we also realized that we didn't want learning to be compromised in the process. And so we shifted as quickly as possible. The ultimate goal was to increase student engagement, but as a campus and a network, we had to plan backward. So what we thought in a second or in the beginning was that engagement was fairly low. And so while we were attempting to increase engagement, we had to make sure we didn't live in a space where we became presumptuous or live in a space where we're making assumptions about students not wanting to learn. And so that caused us to ask a few questions. The first is like, are our students safe? Understanding that our students across the city battle in some cases not only homelessness, but also students living in temporary living situations. We had to think about that. We also had to really think about our students healthy and understanding how COVID is continuing to impact predominantly communities of color. We had to ask ourselves, like, are our students healthy? Are their families healthy as well? And then we had to get to the other questions, such as, can our students even access the work? We knew that a lot of our students didn't actually have tech. We also knew students were working from their phones because we would see them show up in spaces like in Zoom or Google Classroom where they were actually, you could see iPhone pop up at the bottom. And so that in mind, it's like if the student is using an iPhone to access Zoom or Google Classroom, that means they're also probably trying to use their phone to write a paper, or they're using their phone to do math and using the calculator. And so we had to think about tech as well and accessing work. And then we had to get to the meat of why we changed that website, which is how are students even accessing work? And so as staff or members of staff, we were thinking like Zoom can become extremely frustrating when you're on it all day. Google Classroom can become confusing. And when you're toggling between the two, so if you have a teacher who's using Google Classroom, but one who's using Zoom, and you really are just trying to figure out how to navigate it, we thought, how can we norm the platforms for students? And then once we norm it, how can we centralize things so that if I'm a student who has 6 or 7 classes, I know where I can go to access all of these things without jumping through a bunch of emails. And so all of that was important for us as well. All of our teachers who were already acclimated to Google Classroom, whose students were as well, they just had such a great head start. And so for those classes, it was a bit easier. And so what we did is we spearheaded collaboration across departments so that teachers who were more savvy with these platforms, they were able to then work with their colleagues in order to do the same things. So then we redesigned the website in that way, which just made accessibility, as I shared earlier, a lot easier for folks. And all of that work was in essence just to build like a much stronger foundation. Once that foundation was built, we moved forward with holding like virtual town halls for parents. And so we pushed through report cards as usual, but we did all that virtually. Having touch points with parents was profound. We had so many who reached out with their concerns, opening up the channels of communication so that we could hear what the frustrations were on the other end in order for us to troubleshoot on our side. We also attempted to maintain programming wherever possible. Our spring semester is like extremely busy with lots of fun stuff that we were just really sad to not to be able to have in person. But whenever we could, we tried to bring those things virtual. So 2 things that were really big for our spring semester: we do a college signing day for all of our graduating seniors every spring. And so it's one of our hallmark activities. And while it wasn't able to happen in our normal space, we were able to still execute that virtually, which was great for our students. We also continued with our grade level family meetings. And so family meetings are all about fun and building community. And so we still held those spaces as well whenever we could virtually. Our network data team continued to compile engagement data. And so what we saw over time was progressively increased engagement among students. We used that data at the campus level to spearhead and continue our individual check-ins. And so I love that you all mentioned advisory, and I love that it was shared a couple of times before. Advisory literally was a game changer for us, because if we were able to see that a student hadn't been engaged at all, or if a student hadn't been engaged in like a week or two, we could reach out to the advisor first and foremost, and that communication lived through the advisor as opposed to living through the teacher. We then had the advisor to kind of like do a text really quickly, or call a parent or call a student to check in and see how things were going, in the event that there was some sort of support that we could sponsor as a school. Just like many of the other campuses, we were able to send out about 7,000 Chromebooks. And then we sent out about half as many of the hotspots in order to make sure our students had tech. Much of the execution of that lived through our advisors reaching out and just checking in to see what students needed. The last thing I'll share is that our overall success came from checking in on the well-being of our people. We leveraged those relationships with students and families, like Lyria shared earlier. And then establishing firm ground there and examining our systems and processes in order to really refine what we did in the spring. We've brought a lot of those lessons into the summer. And so currently our leadership teams are all thinking about how can we continue to refine so that in the event we are doing quite a bit of virtual learning as opposed to in-person learning in the fall, we've learned some of those lessons and we can hopefully execute it even better.
Brian, we talked a little bit in our pre-call for this webinar about equity issues. And you said that the transition to distance learning and all the stresses that came with that really brought some of those to the forefront. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you experienced there.
Yeah, what was important for us is aside from tech, again, is thinking about our students in the living situations that they're in across the city. And so fortunately, we had a lot of that data ahead of COVID. And so we were able to get in front of some of those situations and issues. So if we're thinking about a student who we know may live between a couple of families, then thinking about like how COVID could adversely impact that student, we could kind of get ahead and say, you know what, let's call student X because we know this is a thing. Let's see if there's any work that we can do as a campus in order to make sure that they're safe and healthy and that they are first and foremost safe and healthy, and then accessing learning from there.
And what about your college-bound seniors? How did they finish out their year?
Oh, how much time do you have?
I think you got about a minute left. Take your time.
So it was I'll actually just pause and say we were really sad just to see senior year wrap that way for deserving and hardworking seniors across the nation, both seniors or students who were leaving middle school and coming to high school, but especially our students who are graduating and then going on to college. So I'll share that the most frustrating thing I think is for the students who still had some loose ends to tie up. Specifically with students who were thinking about or in the middle of verification for financial aid, or just like actually like stuck between like, I'm thinking about these 3 schools and I'm really going to land based on how my award letters shape up. As we all know, various colleges and universities were able to like handle this in different ways. And so for a lot of students, it really sort of their decisions were really based on where were they as of March. Whereas over time, we've seen that a lot of students make that decision actually in April or in May. And so that was probably the biggest issue that our students had to face. I think aside from that, it's been just dealing with communication or trying to execute communication with some colleges that may have been closed or have just not been as responsive as they would have been considering the impact of COVID.
And how many of your seniors are you sending to college this year?
Yeah, so we had 99% of our students who were eligible and who applied were accepted. And of that number who were accepted, we have about 82% of them who are actually headed to college. Cross your fingers that we don't have any decreases in percentages over the summer. We know summer melt is a real thing. And so we're just really hoping to continue pushing forward. We did have quite a few students who were headed to 4-year colleges and universities who've since decided they want to hang around Chicago and transition to our City Colleges program. We are happy to help them with that transition. A lot of students actually just want to be closer to home. A lot of students just really I think, felt the impact of what would it mean to go away, considering COVID. And so we're still in the process of helping some students figure it out, but we're hovering right around 82%.
Congratulations. That's
Yeah.
really something to be proud of. So we've got just a few minutes left. And one thing I want to do is go back to the question that was asked early on about CMOs and summer school. And so, Brian, since you've got the floor, you can start, but I want to hear from all three of you about, because it sounds like that's something that people have some thoughts of. And I was surprised to learn that myself as well.
Yep. Can you refresh or remind me what the question was, just so I make sure I'm
So
answering?
the question was, why did, and Bree jump in and correct me if I have this wrong, but why did so many CMOs decide not to have summer school this summer?
Oh, gotcha. So we are actually having summer school. And I'll share really quickly sort of why and how we're executing a summer school for us. The first is we're doing AP programming. And so for our students who are headed into AP in the fall, we have launched an optional 4-week sort of like prep course that is to both prepare them for what they are walking into, but also to hopefully make up for a loss of learning. We're also doing, I think Bree mentioned a lot of campuses doing credit continuation and recovery, both of which we're doing. And so we are offering recovery for our students actually not only this summer, but also through the fall. The goal there is to make sure for our students who earn Fs in semester 2 to give them just like space and time to recover credit for that course and to get caught up by January 2021. Credit continuation is optional learning, and so we have 7 classes that are happening at Butler. And those classes are all, again, to just reinforce the domains and dimensions that they may have missed, but it gives students an opportunity to engage in some of the fun classes or some fun classes that they may not otherwise see during the or mid of school year. I'm actually teaching a class, and I'm teaching the class because I'm really passionate about teaching that particular topic and subject, but B, because I really want to engage in a way that my teachers do in order to understand some of the perplexities or even some of the frustrations that are associated with virtual learning. And I've learned a few of those very quickly.
Great. And Joanna, where was Rocket Ship on summer school this year?
Yeah, so we didn't offer summer school in DC. We had, of course, a lot of conversations about it. What we really focused on, though, this summer, what we are focusing on is to make sure we open up strong, which is in August, so very soon. And then we are also opening up our 3rd campus in August as well. And so what we did was we really focused on connecting families with summer learning opportunities that exist within the city.
Got it. And Amy, where did Achievement First fall?
Yep, our high schools ran or are running a traditional summer school, which we do credit recovery in high school. So we did that remotely. Grades 3 through 8 participated in the National Summer School Initiative, which our former co-CEO Doug McCurry helped to build and lead. So we're working a subset of students and most schools are participating there.
Great. So a few more questions here. Brian, a question for you. They would like to know what your plans are for the fall as far as distance learning is concerned. Is there anything you're going to be doing differently?
Yeah, so, and sorry for the noise on the street. We are in the middle of figuring out if we're in the middle of deciding what sort of like hybrid process is going to happen. We're trying to, when I say we, Noble is trying to align as closely with CPS as possible, given obviously our proximity to the district, but also that a lot of our students have older or younger siblings who are in CPS schools as well, or traditional CPS schools, I'll say. And so that's where we are in terms of like whether we'll be in person or whether we'll be virtual or the marriage of the two. In terms of our actual processes, so one of the other things that we're doing through summer school is just trying to figure out are our students performing better or do they respond better to asynchronous versus synchronous learning? And so we're doing some of that sort of like research now to figure out like, hey, how is it that our students are responding the most or the best? And then lastly, I thought about this, I think when Joanna was speaking, so many of our students don't get up in the morning. And so one of the other things we're thinking about is just what will it mean if our school day starts at 11 or 12 and then goes until 5 versus trying to get kids engaged at 9 a.m. My class is at 10, and I think 4 of my kids just arrived at like 10:15 because they were waking up. And so what does it mean to shift the school day so that it better accommodates our students? All the while, of course, thinking about our staff, many of which have their own students or own kids at home to think about too.
Okay, well, we have one last poll that is outstanding. We're waiting for the results. And the question was, what do people think is the most important focus for fall? And this is pretty clear that schools need to be prepared with a coherent hybrid model at 65%. Schools fully prepared to enact, I think that's a maximum distance learning at 24% and maximum in-person at 11%. Does that surprise any of my school leaders? No, pretty obvious. Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to thank every single one of you for participating and all that went into putting this together, especially those of you that put the hard work into doing PowerPoints and those of you who put the hard work into making sure babies were sleeping and so you could give your undivided attention. And Brian, thank you for letting us share the video from your school's website. I think this was great, and I hope everybody had a good time doing it. And I hope all the people that participated or participating registered got a lot out of it. And if there are any unanswered questions out there, you can reach out to us at PPI, or I'm sure you can find these educators and researchers on their websites as well. And we just hope everybody had a good time, and we hope that we could do it again sometime.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great
Bye.
night. Bye-bye.